Can you hear me? Okay, great. Fantastic. Thank you, Manan. Wonderful. Dear listeners, thinkers and makers, dear friends and allies, good evening, bonsoir, marhaba, salam and buenos dias. Welcome to Online Talking Heads, Challenging Cybernetic Conspiracy on the 4th of November in 2020 with the artist researcher Bahar Noorizadeh, currently speaking from London, and further panelists are Antoine, Simeão, Schalk, Basile, Collet, and Vanessa Cimorelli. Challenging Cybernetic Conspiracy is the second edition of the public online Talking Heads at Head Genève, curated by Julie Enkel-Juliard, who suggested to focus on new economies of creation, ou les nouvelles économies de la création. To begin with, allow me to thank a few people who have been involved here tonight. Thank you, Julie Enkel-Juliard, for inviting the CCCRP program of the Visual Arts Department into this conversation. Thanks also to Charlotte Lubin for proposing to invite Bahar Noorizadeh in the first place. It's wonderful, dear Bahar, that you agreed to speak tonight about your work and with us. Thank you. Also thanks to Antoine, Basile and Vanessa, second-year students of the CCC, for agreeing to prepare yourself to respond tonight as a kick-off for a subsequent conversation with everyone who wants to join. Thanks also to Julie Conti for the impressive communication, and last but not least, thank you, Alexander Jans, for the cybercritical intelligence while coordinating the technicality of this live stream event behind the scene. It is a pleasure to see such a high number of participants tonight. Of course, our heartfelt thanks to everyone of this webinar for affording your time, the space, the energy, the body and the data to join tonight from your homes in Geneva, in Lausanne, I assume also from Berlin, Paris and London, and from Tehran, I saw sorry, on the chat list, in Mexico City, Laila, and the Belgrade, Sanya, maybe from Pretoria, Siseko with friends. My name is Doreen Mende. I am a curator, a theorist, and professor for curatorial politics and head of the CCCRP program of the Visual Arts Department at Head Genève. We are specialized in research practices by the means of art as a network of practices. We are one of 3 orientations in the master education of visual arts at Head with our sisters Trans and Workmaster, as well as many cousins in the design department at Head. Good evening, dear colleagues. I see quite a few, that's lovely. Alumni also of Head, and dear students of Head and elsewhere. I am speaking from Geneva and Switzerland at this moment. We are in partial lockdown. Our days are filled with visio conferences, webinars, teletravail and telefatigue. We greet you, everyone where you are, and we hope that you are safe and sound amidst these turbulent times, or you recover soon from COVID+. My IP is 188.154.68194. It entails a geolocation that is situated in the old city of Geneva at Chapelle-Pellisseri, which is 1.5 kilometers away from where I'm actually speaking from right now, my kitchen. This throws us already into the middle of the beginning of a techno-geopolitics that displaces places as well as time zones by the means of teletechnologies. Not only that, the amount of data tonight during this webinar will be for each of us around 1.5 gigabyte that will be transferred across our screens, our eyes and ears, cables, raw material, waters, cities, countries, continents, contributing to the violence of planetary computation. We have not even touched yet the data business of data as capital by companies like Instagram or Zoom in surveillance capitalism, or we could call this also cookies capitalism or capitalist realism. Welcome to the techno-realism of machine-mania in the era of financial global capitalism. If you have not yet adjusted your cookies regulating the selling of your 1.5 gigabyte by Zoom, then you might want to consider this. We can distribute at the end quite a few links to learn more about all this. This evening will inquire what could be possible methodologies or concepts or ideas to unsettle this seemingly seamless absolute of data behaviorism under the condition of the recursive colonialism of techno-capitalism regarding politics, social relations, raw materialism, life and death, and knowledge. Could, for example, speculative computation, as Luciana Parisi recently suggested, or a cybernetic communism, as the mathematician Mathilde Marcelli analyzed, or a selfie communism, as Jody Dean suggested a couple of years ago, or a digital internationalism oppose the capital imperative of planetary automation. In our outline of this event, we ask, therefore, how could navigational practices by the means of art research intervene in this machine mania, whose objective is to run the human out of control? What role does art research occupy in a critical understanding about the political economy of such inhuman labor? We will not be able to answer these questions tonight, but we can think with Bahar Noorizadeh and discuss with Vanessa, Antoine, Basile, as well as with you some possible points of entry to open up tonight a shared practice of study. Allow me to introduce our panelists tonight. Bahar Noorizadeh is an artist, a writer, and a filmmaker. Bahar works on the reformulation of hegemonic time narratives as they collapse in the face of speculation, philosophical, financial, legal, futuristic. Noorizadeh's practice examines the relationship between aesthetics and reason, and the desubjectivitation of experience as a pathway for producing new social subjects. In our preparation for this event, also Bahar pointed out a very important question. I'm sure we are going to get there tonight, where she proposed to understand the position of the artist as a position that allows to understand ourselves as a test object to think through these questions of computation and planetary automation under financial global capitalism. Solo exhibitions of Bahar Noorizadeh have been on display at the Wrong Biennial for Digital Culture, Structura Time Podium Gallery in Oslo in 2020, Narrative Projects in London, Mercer Union in Toronto, and Tate Modern in London in 2019 and 18. Since 2018, Bahar pursues a PhD in art at Goldsmiths College in London, University of London, with the working title Weird Economies, Art, Thinking, Finance, something I think that we are also going to hear from Bahar today. It deals with the impact of finance algorithmic capitalism on art and is funded by the SSRC Doctoral Fellowship. And last but not least, the first time in Switzerland dates back to 2017 and 18, when Bahar has been awarded with the research grant of the Summer Academy, Paul-Klee-Zentrum in Bern, where also I was glad to learn about your work, Bahar, for the first time. And also, I think quite a few remember also Bahar's work exhibited and on display at the Centre d'Art Contemporain, I think Biennale Image en Mouvement 2018. Antoine Simeão Schalk is a fluid creature interested in questions regarding queer and non-white bodies, who studied political sociology at the University of Lausanne and at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, before starting the CCCRP Master at HED Genève. And they are currently an exchange student with the Kunsthochschule Weißensee, where Antoine is speaking from Berlin at this moment. They are a curator and co-curator of the artist-run space 1G in Fock in Genève, and also a contributor to the Rosa Mercedes online journal, Issue Mutual Aid. Vanessa Cimorelli lives and works in Geneva, currently speaking from Geneva. Vanessa graduated from both HED Genève in visual communication and the University of Lausanne in English literature, linguistics, and social sciences. Currently, Vanessa continues her studies at the CCC, focusing on questions of corporeality, gender, space, and virtuality. Vanessa also contributed to the Rosa Mercedes online journal on the issue in Mutual Aid earlier this year. Last but not least at all, Basile Collet graduated from the Fine Arts School in Nantes. The geographical proximity of this French city to militant practices of the environmental resistance of the SAD of Notre-Dame-des-Landes made Basile to grow interest to research Imaginaries of inhabiting the environmental crisis on a global scale. In his art practice, Basile embarks on a transdisciplinary research crossing collapsology, science fiction, autonomous practices, and art making. Last but not least, before we start with Bahar's presentation, please do allow me to map out a few Zoom-specific points. So please keep your video off and the microphone on unmute during Bahar's presentation that will last about 20 minutes. You already can ask questions in the Q&A function here of Zoom during Bahar's presentation. So if you have a thought or something that you would like to ask and comes to your mind, you can put this into the Q&A and we can follow up on that already and prepare also like a line of questions for the conversation after Vanessa, Basile, and Antoine have responded to Bahar's presentation. Yes, so Vanessa, Basile, Antoine have prepared some responses to Bahar's presentation. Thank you so much for that, to engage in that trajectory. And that will help us to kick off this conversation with all of us. It will all take around, Bahar's presentation about 20 minutes, then responses about 10, 15 minutes, and then we still have like 30 minutes if we want for a mutual conversation. Please feel free to join the conversation soon after. In order to save time, if you agree and allow, we will read aloud your questions from the Q&A, and we will ask to unmute your microphone only if the question is unclear. Just a matter of practicality to save a bit of time. It will be appreciated, dear attendees, if you can help to share in the chat the references that are mentioned during the talk or the conversation. We will do our best to follow up on that, yet it is helpful if you can join in. We will save the chat to collect, we will save then afterwards the chat to collect and share the references then after the event is finished. And last but not least, an important question or kind of remark, we are recording the event, this session, this webinar, and we ask for your permission, please, that we are allowed to record. And if you do not feel comfortable to be mentioned in the Q&A or similar, then please do let us know. Thank you very much, everyone. Dear Bahar, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Doreen, and everybody else for this invitation. I mean, it's great because I feel like we have this continuous conversation with the CCC program. I was there last year this time in conversation with the students, and it's just like really strange that in a span of a year, we're just talking from home. So what I'm going to be talking about is primarily new material around my current research, the PhD work that Doreen mentioned. Essentially, I'm trying to trace a trajectory from using myself as a test subject, as Doreen mentioned, from the solo artist practitioner towards something that I would call a more speculative platformed form of making art together. I'm making an example of 3 projects as I go through this process, but here tonight I'm just gonna discuss the first project and the last project and kind of build the theoretical ground of like how I reached from this one to that one. So without further ado, I'm just gonna get into it. Sharing my screen. 1 second. Okay, so I think I can't do full screen because I still want to read from my laptop. So just bear with the unfinished look, please. So basically in 2018, I worked on a project called After Scarcity. And the intention was to excavate past futures that would incite or trigger a sense of political and economic imagination that, as many have diagnosed in the past decades, it's lacking from our current political discourse, and especially from the field of economics. And to contextualize a bit the project of After Scarcity, so in the aftermath of 2008 financial collapse, as the conversations around financialization turned mainstream, some people on the left started to revisit the overlooked cybernetic developments in the Andes, Chile, and the USSR. So in After Scarcity, I focused on the latter and basically on how a group of cyberneticians from 50s to 80s worked to build a decentralized computer network across the Soviet Union to facilitate and streamline the lumbering planned national economy. And so the Khrushchev regime realized at that point that it has no option to succeed against its capitalist counterpart other than taking advantage of computers that emerged during the Stalinist 50s. And more specifically, basically these Soviet scientists, they anticipated the coming of the internet, which hadn't arrived yet in the US. But not in the way that we engage with the internet today, primarily for atomized self-promotion and online commerce in the service of the market, but to put them at the service of large-scale socialist planning. And so the arguments in favor of cybernetic economics have ever since considered cybernetic planning as a response to a popular economic debate that stretched across the 20th century called the socialist calculation problem. And so basically the socialist calculation problem, it's a critique that early market ideologues posed against the centralizing schemes of the European socialist planners, primarily in the Vienna Circle during the interwar years. According to Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, who were figureheads of Austrian School of Economics, any attempt at a centralized social planning was bound to lose the game of efficiency to the super calculator of the market. And the problem was actually the sheer amount of data that had to be collected, stored, processed, analyzed, and circulated at every moment by the centralized system to retain the national economy at its optimum performance. So as opposed to that, in contrast, Hayek and von Mises, they insisted that price is the most accurate means of measuring change and emergence in a dynamic social system. And through pricing, the capitalist economy, basically it could bypass those unnecessary calculations that centralized planning would do and achieve its spontaneous order. So it would be a sort of like self-sustained computer without needing constant centralized control and maintenance. This is how they imagine the market to be. So the market as a computer, and price not as one of its properties, but quite literally the measure of change in society at large. So they kind of elevated it to this metaphysical status. So as Philip Mirovsky, economic philosopher, writes, the socialist calculation controversy, it was basically the starting point of the economics of information. A conversation that worked to classify perspectives on the role of knowledge in economics into its primary constitutive camps. But even more consequential for the history of economics, the debate basically impelled the opponents of socialism to formulate their core ideas of what the market is and what it does. So they basically came up with their notion of the market through their opposition to socialist planning through the socialist calculation problem debate. So as Ola Inset remarks, their idea of the market was nothing less than the bedrock of civilization. In a way, it signifies how the tenets of neoliberal thought originated in opposition or in reaction to the growing socialist and planning sentiments of the interwar years in Europe. So in 2008, when the potentials of big data and new modes of cybernetic management for mega platforms like Amazon and Walmart kind of turned exceedingly more evident for the left, looking at these contingent histories of cybernetic planning allowed an imagination of capture and control of these platform monopolies and repurposing them towards public and socialist goals or ends. So as valid as these observations are, they are primarily focused on the market, or let's say platform architecture as the market, as a means of rationalizing and augmenting economic efficiency. The concern is to make the system more efficient, to basically to emphasize again as a direct response to neoliberal's critique of the calculation problem in socialist systems. However, like I would like to address an often disregarded aspect of Hayek's theory of the market, which is the problem of knowledge, that usually goes unnoticed with the cybernetic planning camp. And this is like a way of kind of like self-critique of my own understanding of after scarcity, like 2 years after the making of it. So this other seminal essay of Hayek, The Use of Knowledge in Society, it's published within the same book as the socialist calculation problem. So the intention is not to necessarily like divert from the necessity of, design of socialist platforms, but to elaborate on what kind of socialist platforms would be desirable, to be more specific with the making of it. So in this next part, I have to give a shout out to Bassem Saad, the co-writer of this text that we were recently working on, and part of the following text derives from are writing together, and he actually put forward the, this idea of David Cronenberg's Cosmopolis as we centered the essay around. So in Cronenberg's Cosmopolis, the main character, Packer, Eric Packer, he's a currency speculator, and his venture strategy is essentially based on the study of complex patterns in nature, which is the mathematical quotes, the mathematical properties of tree rings, sunflower seeds, the limbs of galactic spirals from the original text. He actually turns out to be an awful speculator by the end of the film, and loses all his money speculating on the hike of Chinese yuan in the book, and then they change it to Japanese yen, I think, in the film. So curiously, Packer's mathematical naturalist investment strategy is nowhere as near as how the progenitors of the neoliberal thought collective, most notably Hayek, perceive the market to be. In fact, along his critique of the rising socialist sentiments in Vienna, Hayek's first line of defense was against the prevalent scientism of the time. Quote from his text, the mechanical and uncritical application of habits of thought to fields different from those in which they have been formed. This scientism today resides not with the long fallen Viennese or the Soviet socialist planners, but actually with neoclassical economists who are chairing the departments of economics at LSE and University of Chicago. As Philip Mirowski has shown in detail, at the age of brazen science denialism, economic scientism in this sense is part of the problem, not obviously the solution. This is because economic science since the 19th century, and especially in its neoclassical development throughout 20th century, is a direct imitation of Newtonian physics. And Mirowski has a book on this one-to-one relationship between Newtonian physics and neoclassical economics, which is what's primarily in practice in the field of economics today. So the American orthodoxy also was the product of further waves of physicists, like cascading over into economics during the Great Depression and World War II. And Mirowski also gives the example of Paul Krugman, famous economist, who has said that he turned towards economy because he'd fallen in love with science fiction as a kid. Since the 80s, there's been actually a resurgence of physicists again in the field of economics, because their own discipline basically has faced shrinkage post the Cold War, and they have entered banks and hedge funds as designers of these statistical algorithms and complex predictive models. So again, as Mirowski emphasizes, the discourse of economics since the 18th century has been taking its validation from natural sciences. This was a way of accentuating its validity, basically. And that's the scale of nature's involvement in this new science. Like, there is no figure of the nature, it's just the formulaic the physics kind of relationship. So for Hayek, the concern of economy, and this is like the point that I was trying to drive at, the concern of economy at its core was the problem of knowledge. And more specifically, for him, there was two types of knowledge. There was the scientific one, which he was repudiating through this, these points that I mentioned. And the other one was the knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. The figure of the individual holds like a particular knowledge at any time and place that no one else has access to. And this is what gives any individual an upper hand. So as he says, it is due to the latter form of knowledge that any individual has the whip hand over another. And for this reason, no single mind nor Politburo committee can have access to the sum of economic data in advance. And this figure of time is important because basically what he's saying is that that information can't be given in advance. That's the work of the market. It is through the very machinery of the market with its ethos of competition and price setting devices, and with a forward-looking conception of time counter to the system stasis of neoclassicism, that knowledge is disseminated across individuals. So market is the sole metaphysical information processor that knows more than any individual excuse me, can or could ever know. So the market knows it's the all-knowing kind of entity, but even more, it's not only a computer. So this is the cybernetic model, but market, through this description of Hayek, is in and of itself a speculative space. And these rationalist socialist delusions for Hayek, as he thought, were symptoms of a barbaric regression. He was saying, like, if human beings can't comprehend their own limits of rationality, this is because we are moving towards a barbaric regression. And for him, civilization is made possible through restraint. So the acknowledgement of the limits of our rational faculties and our capacities to know and design. And this is what he says. So again,
sorry, Bahar?
Yeah.
Do you mind moving the slide a little bit to the left so we can get the whole thing?
Oh, yes, sorry.
Thank you.
Of course.
Sorry.
No worries. Fast forward again to 2008 as the key moment when basically mass bailout of commercial banking system turned common practice as a sort of like informal insurance on the ability of the markets to establish order in the long run. So I'm going to explain this later, actually, maybe not to spend too much time over this. But basically, in the turmoil of the crisis, some factions of the left saw an opportunity for capture and control. There was all these conversations about the death of neoliberalism as it keeps emerging during any crisis at 2008, even like in the beginning of COVID somehow. But basically, a growing number of alternative think tanks, new economic forums, and symposiums, they set to rouse the long dormant like economic libido with a sharp return to macroeconomics, which is post-Keynesian planning, that kind of like, you know, the model of economics which asks for more like state intervention that came before the birth of neoliberalism. And these calls for older economic solutions are usually accompanied by a critique of speculation as the emergent property of financial markets in the 80s. So Martin Konings, also political economist, in his book Capital and Time, he problematizes the regressive nature of these heterodox economics war on speculation. He says that their appeal to foundationalism is particularly absurd when one considers how every other domain of humanities and social sciences in the past half a century has undergone an anti-essentialist epistemic crisis, but somehow the economic science stays like rigid and put. In reverting to an essentialist notion of value, critiques of speculation not only miss the autopoietic essence of money, which is its a priori status as a container for fictional expectations, but also they rid economics from imagining itself otherwise. Producing unorthodox knowledge, which is so vital to contemporary struggles, demands imagination. And appeals to regulation itself, as Philip Mirovsky asserts, is some kind of symptom of a bankruptcy of economic imaginary. This is not to say that bankers, hedge funds, and speculators on the floor were any more future forward or speculative with their activities. Actually, that's part of the problem. The orthodox engineers of financial instruments, like we said, in line with their physics, education, and understanding of the economy, they also contributed to this antiquated design of derivative instruments. Basically, Black-Scholes formula, which is the mathematic formula that's applied to derivative pricing, it comes directly from thermodynamics, like a very classical idea of thermodynamics, and Mirovsky talks about this too. So these financiers who were designing the algorithms, basically the CDOs and the CDSs were designed to repackage risk and allocate it to those who could undertake it, which is the entire logic of risk distribution in new mode of capitalism. Basically this is a theory itself based on the abandoned theory of efficient market hypothesis, which maintains that all information that is required for a transaction is coded into the price of the instrument. And neither of these theories basically leave any space for considering systemic failure, since they assume that everything that can be figured in the stochastic models can be subjected to insurance. So because they don't have a conception of an outside to the system, nature doesn't exist for the market, they can't even come up with the idea of systemic failure, because if the price contains the information, then you can hedge it with an insurance, and then it would stabilize itself somehow. So the zombified institutions post 2008, to follow Yanis Varoufakis' expression, no more alive nor dead, they were handed to us at 2020 with the onset of the global pandemic. And here, an extraordinary event basically happens, as Varoufakis writes, which we've been waiting for, but it hadn't transpired yet. In August 2020, a few months ago, the financial market was fully decoupled from the real market of goods and services. So as the UK basically undergoes its worst recession ever, and the US starts to appear as a failed state, the London Stock Exchange Index surged, and Wall Street's SP 500 hit a historic high. The future markets have no more regard for the earthlings' games of trade and survival. So, but to finish this part, if following Hayek's formulation, the market knows best the truth regarding nature itself, whether there is an ongoing pandemic or not, because this is the idea of science denialism, that we can only trust the nature. And this is basically, where Donald Trump becomes a spokesperson for the market. He's only reiterating what the market is telling us. So which market story are we to believe in the current paradox of the economy? The real market is saying that, and by extension nature, that we are in deep trouble. But the future markets, they narrate a narrative of like stealing prosperity. Hayek would actually side with the latter probably, as he did during the 70s. Later in his life, he saw in the financial turmoil of the 70s a movement that was highly subversive. And for the same reason, it was imbued with the possibility of economic recovery. They bank on crisis, neoliberals. But today, outside the bubbles of pandemic denialism and science skepticism of the populist international, we can, to save our lives, put our faith into the narrative told by the money markets, that the pandemic doesn't exist. But as long as the speculative substance of economy is not taken to heart, and the problematics of time and epistemology, the problem of knowledge that's at the core of Hayek's critique of rational planning, is overlooked, we are just circling a vicious historical cycle. So this was the theoretical part of my work. Now I'm just gonna, hopefully I have few more minutes to wrap this up. To return to after scarcity, the cybernetics projects in the Soviet Union were never accomplished. Benjamin Peters, a media scholar, he has a very expanded, elaborate book on the subject. And he provides several reasons for this, for the failure of the Soviet cybernetics planning. But there's not enough space to get into. But in retrospect to Peter's diagnosis, I would just want to add another term, which is cybernetics in the Soviet Union, or the way that people theorized it later, or actually conceptualized it later. It's basically pursued the project of mimicking its own image of the market as a self-sustained and complete system of knowledge. And this was essentially an extension of the neoclassicals project of rational economism or like scientism. Cybernetics could amplify efficiency, but it wouldn't answer to neoliberals' problem of knowledge. Hayek did not think that knowledge is readily available within the mainframe of the market, but he thought of the market as a necessary epistemological tool. Market would still rely on institutional framings, that is politics, to establish social coordination. And again, there's this wonderful essay by Evgeny Morozov called Digital Socialism, which he addresses the core of this issue, the problem of knowledge with cybernetics thinking. The price system works so efficiently for Hayek because capitalism did the rest, so it still relied on the institutional framing. So to follow the aspirations of after scarcity, that is, as I mentioned, the necessity of thinking, imagining, and designing platform socialisms or platforms otherwise. We arrive at the significance of retaining the speculative substance of economy rather than retailing it for cybernetic efficiency. And this is basically at the core of my current ongoing project called Weird Economies, which is a cooperative art platform and online programming space focused on economic futurisms and speculative politics. So Weird Economies will, I think the last slide, will essentially trace these economic imaginaries that are extraordinary to the financial visions of our time. Because as we see, the way that finance is treated is still very much, regressive, speculative. It's not, there's nothing like future forward about the practice of finance. The kind of like area that Weird Economies will engage in expands from historical precedents of common-based alternative economies based on beyond the global north to current experimentations with blockchain finance and decentralized autonomous organizations, to science fictional scenarios for post-financial wars. And the goal is basically to institute a transdisciplinary community of artists, thinkers, radical economists, cooperative activists, P2P, software architects, designers, lawyers, researchers concerned with building these post-capitalist wars. And this body of contributors would constitute Weird Economies' eventual stakeholders and shareholders, and amongst whom the platform's authorship and ownership will be distributed, basically. And I'm trying to basically initiate an institutional network within contemporary arts ecosystem that actually goes beyond the safeguarding of intellectual property by individual organizations. So there's going to be multiple institutions involved and thinking about building an infrastructure for this type of practice, this practice of speculating together. And to realize ways of socializing and liquidating the mass of concentrated cultural capital in the contemporary art regime. So if, as Michel Feher elaborates a note on subjectivity, the unexpected outcome of the neoliberal project was the transformation of the entrepreneurial ethos, the neoliberal subject, into the portfolio manager, which is a different type of subject than the entrepreneurial. That's the one that the neoliberals imagined, but Feher claims that now we basically moved into the portfolio manager subjectivity, which is the financialized subject. And the artist as speculator basically personifies the subject of the financialized era perfectly. After all, the artist in its modern tradition has been the case in point of the individuals who says not what she has, but who she is. To the point that this vulgar recognition is often established post-mortem as the mythologized genius artist, the Hegelian notion of the genius. That is to say, basically, the financial subject of the 21st century is not the businessman of the neoclassical economics, which is who is motivated by profit and capital maximization, but actually the artist who's motivated by credits and self-maximization. So the very last notes, in its design, weird economies primarily would ask the question of whether the atomized reputation of capital, reputation capital of art, so the solo artist, the acclaimed institution, can be more fairly distributed and decentralized. So can we distribute the reputation economy is one of the central questions. And in this sense, the weird in weird economies is a way of plotting and socializing the future without repressing or essentializing its promissory potentials. While the crisis, the multiple crises we're going through, hit across class stratums and national territories in a differential logic, only few can hedge and profit from the collapse while it lasts, like the likes of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. So the semantics of risk, which Ulrich Beck talks about, is lopsided towards the new information class. And this is one reason why, as Economic Space Agency writes in their white paper, it is of great urgency today to invest in ways of risking and speculating together, to play on the double character of finance. For finance, rather than being restricted to monetary value, as Eric Bordello talks about, a lot of quotations here, but these are like people that I've been inspired by in the past few years. So finance, rather than being restricted to monetary value, it could also be remodeled as an artistic medium, a mode of coordinating the future and its emerging possibilities through the collective design of attractors and the distribution of flows of desire. This demands the invention of a new economic language capable of valuing beyond the singular metrics of money, to make expressible activities, processes, and flows currently invisible and therefore immeasurable by capital's politics of valuation. But also to risk together demands a corresponding infrastructure in place, and we need to be working on building such infrastructures that enables us to be more risk-prone. Economy, from the combination of Greek oikos and neime, refers to the management of the household. So Freud's concept of unheimlich is not alien to economy in this regard, if we dispose of its poor English translation, the uncanny, in favor of the more fitting, the unhomely. Weird economists tries to designate such unhomely governances of the household. If our anthropomorphic vision today is skewed towards the interior of these familiar and familial edifices, the question to be asked is which visualizing organisms and what modes of observation can help us view these unhomely economies from outside. This in order to take the alienating measures required for understanding systemic complexities determining our shared planetary conditions today. Thank you. I feel like I went very over time, but this is it. And I had no time to show an excerpt of the video, so I hope that's
Thank you so much, Bahar. Maybe if possible, are there some also like resources online to watch perhaps some of your work?
I can play an excerpt of the video if it's fine. A few minutes. So this is after scarcity, which I mentioned in the beginning.
Sure, the few minutes we have, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, I don't know, can you do a full screen, your screen perhaps?
И вот кибернетика впервые в истории человека позволила заглянуть немножко в будущее. То есть уже сегодня на современном этапе развития кибернетики можно ставить вопрос о следующей ступени увековечения личности человеческого бессмертия. Когда человек, творец, может оставлять потомству не только готовые результаты своего труда, но и свой творческий метод. И не исключено, что придет такое время, когда будет возможен переход человеческого интеллекта и чувств, эмоций полностью в память электронной вычислительной машины. Прекращение существования человека в этом новом кибернетическом облике может произойти либо в силу несчастного случая, который никогда не исключается, либо в силу собственного человеческого желания. Ну, примерно так, как это, скажем, сказано у одного из моих любимых поэтов Гёте в его знаменитом «Фаусте». Когда воскликну я мгновенье, прекрасно ты, продлись, постой, тогда готов мне цепь пленения. Земля разверзлась предо мной, твою неволю разрешая, пусть смерти зов услышу я, и станет стрелка часовая, и время минет для меня.
Виктор Михайлович, а вы сами хотели бы обрести бессмертие с помощью компьютера?
Да, конечно, да.
Great, thank you, Bahar.
Thank you.
And we just also Bahar will share the video with the password for everyone who wants to follow up. So just to let everyone know before we forget to share this. Voilà. Antoine, Basile, ou Vanessa, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Bahar, for your very compelling presentation. Maybe unless there is urgent questions, or unless anyone wants to start, I can start with the questions. I was wondering in one of the questions that you addressed, which was what kind of socialist platform would be more desirable, and in also an aspect of after scarcity that seemed to me to be trying to propose alternatives that would go beyond the binary opposition that we finally oftenly kind of set when we address capitalist and socialism critiques. How do you try to address or to propose those alternatives that go beyond that binarity without going precisely into that kind of hyper-regulated third way solution that Michel Ferrer, that you've quoted, has expressed critiques on?
This is a very good question. Also, I think obviously from like the experiments of the past, like, you know, half a century, or let's say like not few decades, definitely half a century or to a century, there's not only one solution. Like now we're reaching the point that we need to amplify like the space of solutions, and I'm constantly looking for what would my positionality as an artist could add to this conversation. So it's you know, there's a cybernetics like input output from the practice of art to, you know, the practice of politics that I think is at work in my research and in the work of like many people around me that I know. I mean, to answer your question, I mean, I think Feher's proposition of counter speculation is something that's worthy of like looking further into, especially because it involves the character of the artist so much. Like every conversation around the reputation economy is basically the, you know, the bread and butter is the currency of the art world. So it's something that we have access to and we have a knowledge of, and we exercise it on a daily basis from our field. So that might be an angle to think about how artists can think about reputation economy in a more imaginative sense. Because that's what Feher says, just to like give a brief you know, explanation to those who haven't read his work, that instead of like going back to that previous model of, you know, essentialized value and an essentialized sense of profit, we need to bank on these, you know, new states of credit-based or reputation-based capital, and find ways of socializing around them. So this would be the activity of like the future forms of activism. Yeah, I hope that answered partly. I'm also in a bit of a hallucinatory like mode at the end of the day.
I can understand that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can continue if that's okay. Thank you, Bahar, for your work. So I was thinking about this idea of that Soviet cybernetics as a future that never was, that could have been, and so that is actually not a failure because it never existed. So we cannot really say it's not working compared to capitalism, for example. Now we have many examples that it fails as this as a system, as a sustainable system for the planet, for humans, for knowledge, etc., etc. And in your video, you wrote utopia is a socio-economic genre of science fiction, and so it actually made me think that somehow the idea of utopia that we have is also based on this capitalistic system, something that we know, or something that we project in the future, for example, for good or for bad. And because we have the past that forge imaginaries, but what you said today, the difference, I would say, between imaginaries and speculation here also is really interesting. Like this Soviet cybernetic is somehow a form of speculation, whereas the imaginaries of the Soviet Union and the Soviet system that existed is now is completely different. I mean, I don't know if you see what I mean, but there's like this tension between speculation and imaginaries, and I think it's really interesting to think through something that never existed actually for a better future actually. What do you think?
Yeah, that's also a very good point, and we sort of went over this briefly when we talked privately a few days ago, but I also think maybe this distinction between imagination and speculation, there is something to be said about this difference, which actually leads to what you just said. Like we discussed this with, the work of like many theorists and the, in the recent years, that there's almost this kind of the nostalgia around like the death of imagination. And this is like, these are matters of self-critique, because I started from these points and I tried to, look around it and expand my scope. And I think there's something to be said about how imagination in a way becomes equal to the problem of scale thinking for the left, and this inability to be able to comprehend, cognitively hold like the complexity of the planetary systems turns into this nostalgia for the time that we could imagine the scale. And in a way, I think maybe we need to shift the conversation from this failure of imagination to a form of imagination that's not bound to our cognitive capacity. So that's kind of like what I'm trying to think of speculation to be, as not necessarily bound to a kind of anthropomorphic understanding of the environment. Yeah, and like I kind of like this distinction of anthropomorphism and anthropometrism, because we still, our project is, of course, has the figure of the human, as a primary subject within it, but it doesn't need to, calculate it with the tools and instruments that our bodies have, let's say.
Great, thank you. Antoine.
I would also have I would also want to further discuss a bit on the question on imagination, as we have discussed a few days ago. I want to know if you could elaborate maybe on the neoliberal condition in which we find ourselves embedded with, and how it affects our subjectivities on one hand, and our capacity to think and imagine new economies on the other, because that is the issue of imagination, as you pointed out, is central to other authors such as Mark Fisher in Capitalism Realism. So I wanted to know, to have your take on that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, and these questions are also very open-ended for me because I'm constantly trying to, you know, rethink them as I move forward. But I think essentially like what we're trying to get at is that, of course, imagination is something that matters for matters of like political organizing, for anything that requires a public participation. We need to insert some form of imagination, but to be able to distinguish that from, you know, maybe a form of politics that doesn't necessarily, you know, anchor itself on our possibility to imagine or our potential to imagine, like whether that thing could exist. I think this is also a very kind of central question to my work, even like mainly as an artist, because this is kind of part of our practice too. Like we are the creators, like traditionally we were the creators of imagination. So what would happen to our practice and our field if like, you know, the centrality of like, you know, our bodies, like how it configures, like, you know, the environments these days is not, you know, it doesn't hold that significance anymore. And like what kind of art would that be, or like why, you know, how would we think about organizing differently? I think basically I just returned your question with another question, because I really don't exactly know the answer to that.
Thank you. We have a few questions that I'm going to read, and also one attendee, as it's called here in the Zoom language, is raising their hand. I start with the first question by Elizabeth Fischer. Good evening, Elizabeth. Great to see your name and to read you. So Elizabeth asks, when, dear Bahar, you talk about a new financial mode from the position of the businessman to that of the artist, do you think issues around gender are also at play? Historically, there has been a hierarchy in favor of men artists. Is it still an issue in the new model proposed? Thank you.
Of course, I think this is also where, like, I just refer to Feher's original understanding of this like practice of counter speculation. He actually references, you know, the current movements of BLM and Me Too as, you know, that's where the real understanding of, you know, reputation is in practice. You know, this is where there's an understanding of what's, you know, credibility means and how to mobilize, you know, social media platforms or like the platform economy to take away credit from people or to give credit to people, and, you know, how to make a movement around credibility to make certain things, you know, more attractive, you know. And these are like vulgar, you know, words for us, but the way that, you know, Feher is formulating them, this issue of like attractiveness is really like central to understanding the reputation economy. So if there's a way for us to collectively make certain things more attractive, that's basically already being done with Me Too and Black Lives Matter, and, you know, like all these movements that are actually have at their core like an issue of social justice. So I hope that answers that.
Well, I think this is a huge question, and as we also, I mean, discuss a lot, the continuity of the kind of coloniality of power, coloniality of gender in algorithmic infrastructures is something debated and discussed continuously, and I think that's an important point to take on board. I'm not sure whether we are already done with Me Too and Black Lives Matter and that sense, as we just see also what's happening. But I would like to continue with a few more questions that we have here by Anna Engelhardt. Thank you very much, who says, thanks for the stunning presentation. And do you think your project inherits the Robin Hood coup imitation-driven model, with you constructing the infrastructure to redistribute the reputation capital being aligned but unhomely different towards already existing economies? Would it be interesting for you, it would be interesting to hear you to elaborate on what would be similarities and differences between your platform and their project?
I'm familiar with Robin Hood Co-op, but not to that extent to talk about this in detail. But essentially what you're describing as, that's exactly the description that I would give. Thanks for writing it down. It is an infrastructure that would think about how to redistribute the reputation capital, but basically to do that, you need to build that infrastructure. So this is what the very ambitious goal is, and many people I know from basically blockchain activism fields, you know, software activism, you know, there are many people who are working on similar projects, and maybe a group that I was quite inspired by, I mentioned them in the talk, it was the Economic Space Agency. I mean, there are certain issues with that, but they've also been working on it through a very like kind of complex financial mathematical modeling of this blockchain app. Their central project is to distribute value, to tokenize and distribute the notion of value and allow, you know, communities to form around this blockchain network. And it's run by a number of radical economists and finance theorists. So there are many interesting projects that are happening definitely outside the art world, but they seem very artistic. Like when you look at them, it's just that it's very complicated to understand their engineering, but they're also like involved with artists in a way.
Thank you. An important question I would like to read is from an anonymous attendee. What are the means to encounter censorship in this cybernetic period that you talk about? Here we see the artists and curators give into the helplessness in front of Zoom's censorship of Palestine's activists. And this relates to a Zoom webinar that was a response of a cancelled webinar with Leila Khalid at the, I think, New School in New York a couple of weeks ago, including Fred Mote and Leila Khalid, that was cancelled, censored by Zoom, which I think the attendee is here describing too. What do you think? I remember, it brings to my mind a conversation, recent one by Anatesh Rapinto and Nikhil Pal Singh, where the question came up, when is it important to leave, to not contribute and not engage into the infrastructure that are kind of a continuation, perpetuation of a coloniality of power? And I think it comes, is this kind of an appendix, anonymous attendee, which I don't know whether it's the same person. No, someone else, it seems. Okay, it's a question of censorship with platform capitalism, colonial recursion, and speculative computation.
I mean, it's a very valid point, and again, a very difficult one to answer like so briefly, but I mean, yes, essentially, like most of these conversations around, you know, platform socialism is actually pointing to the fact that how this would just perpetuate, you know, the surveillance industry, the more gatekeeping, the more, you know, the more censorship. So I think essentially this is why we need to, first of all, at least in the art world, we need to really find ways of like bypassing this arbitrary institutional like gatekeeping, first of all. I'm not sure that when we move beyond it, then, you know, how we would address censorship, because that's a political issue too. It might need more than just like, you know, reframing the platform technology. But until then, I think this is one thing we can do, because there is no reason for like, you know, 6 institutions to tell someone not to speak on it, you know, on such an important topic. It's actually quite absurd, yeah.
Absolutely, and we have prepared some links to be distributed at the end to study the terms and conditions of Zoom and what everyone can do to avoid to be extracted from all the data as a kind of a form of capital to trade with third partners of Zoom, for example. And this also at the same time shows and indicates the profound implicatedness of each of us, not only participating, but also being situated in these forms of infrastructure by writing an email via an Outlook system, for example. But analysis is key, and positioning as well. There are 2 more questions, and also I don't want to omit the person that raised the hand. I would give space and to this also still, and maybe also then Vanessa and Antoine and Basile would like to add something, and that we have like another 10, 15 minutes more. So Antoine Burcher wrote a question, and as a question or as also like a commentary. I think today we are in front of a wall. I think we have to find a way to discuss all together, left and right. Imagination is the best tool. Isn't the role of the artist today to help bringing people together? Maybe we have to think about other alternatives, go further than old economic systems proposals. Isn't the role of the artist to bring people together from different classes and deconstruct systems, including art institution hierarchy, and let them think together by showing the frame, letting people imagine together and showing the frame?
Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. I agree with parts of it, but also I think essentially this is also what I responded to the last question. There's an issue of, you know, when we bypass the frame, the apparatus, the institutional, there's still the problem of the political, and that political shift might not, you know, the institutional reimagination might not be enough to insinuate that political shift. Like that needs like a much broader like institutional reworking. So especially in a world where, you know, 50% of the United States just voted for Donald Trump.
Don't say his name, please.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
Much to talk about, much to debate. And I think also the question of techno-geopolitics is a key element in that, regarding the techno infrastructures we are operating. And there is a comment also by Miriam Simon. We can, Zoom, we can also use free open source Jitsi. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And the thing is, we have tried this many times, and it does not work as well as it does with like Zoom regarding to share the screen, to have so many people in the same space. Maybe it has improved in the meantime, but several attempts we did with seminars, it just didn't work as it would need to work. But I think, and I hope many people are working on those kind of open source infrastructures as well. Thank you. Thank you, Miriam. There is still one question before I also will ask, there is still one, there are two more questions. So shall we say, everyone, that we have like altogether 10 minutes more, that we finish like shortly past 8:30, if everyone agrees, because this is a very also important point. So anonymous Antoine D, how does thinking creatively of reputation economy not essentialize the artist into the entrepreneur caricature, ultimately excluding all other forms of engagement with art, as well as protest, refusal, and merely different type of temperament that does not entail performativity or administrative qualities than this sort of self-production may require, particularly in algorithmic reality? Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I think so. I would just refer to my understanding of Fehe's kind of discussion of the counter-speculative activism, which I don't think it has much to do with, reinforcing a sense of creativity, whereas to understand that there is nothing essential about value. So this is like the bulk of what I was talking about with the kind of like the critiques of, political economy that want to take us back to an idea of like an essential notion of value. So the idea is that there was never an essential notion of value. There was never like, a very clear-cut, idea of what value is. So if we actually respect that idea, we would already, we were always in the field of speculation in a way, just like to different extents. And if we want to take that seriously, we need to find ways of doing it together. So the togetherness is at stake of, can we find ways of risking together or speculating together? And to be able to risk together, then we need the infrastructure to allow us to be risk prone, to not, to not distribute risk in the way that it's distributed today, completely asymmetrical. So that's kind of, what he sees in the activity of counter speculation, that he's making an example of it, BLM and Me Too, that there are movements that are already understanding that we are the ones who are giving each other credit and reputation. And we can actually have an influence over corporations, over platforms with our participations as investees, because they are investing in us and we can rate them. So he calls it the rating activism. The rating, as as subtle as it seems, but like if we think of it as a collective activity, it might have a force. So this is what he means by this form of new activism, but it's not so much about creativity as I understand it.
I think that the question was very much also regarding concretely the forms of practices of an artist, or also how this condition is shifting kind of the field of action, or the kind of field of demands for an artist, and whether to accept or not, or whether to refuse or not those kind of imperatives that are imposed by those infrastructures. And so your argument is it's not necessarily by definition kind of buying into this entrepreneurial model when you speak of building an institution, for example, or like generating a platform that allows collectivizing kind of efforts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And collectivizing forms of refusal, basically, which is also, I think it's a very ongoing subject in the arts, how to form this refusal. I think there's no other way than doing it as a collective, otherwise we keep like being in this symbolic space of refusal.
And the principle of neoliberalism that wants everyone to be a part.
Mm.
There is a last question from the Q&A, and allow me to read it. It's, I pronounce maybe the name not correctly, Heidi Seles. I hope I'm not totally wrong. Excuse really my not very good pronunciation. Hi Bahar and CCC and Ted. Thanks for making this happening. I was curious to hear you more on this question of language and economy, more precisely on this question of the unheimlich, the uncanny or unhomely, and house management. Hasn't neoliberal economy as a cultural phenomenon always potentially played with this tension between the familiar, such as known, accessibility, and the visible, and the uncanny, secret, and the abstract, and the opaque?
I need to read it a few times to unpack. What do you mean as in by played? I hope you can type an answer or talk. I don't know. Maybe if you can like unpack this middle paragraph of playing with the familiar and the uncanny.
I think Alex, I cannot unpack because I have not asked the question. I'm just a messenger, moderator. The person who asked the question would like maybe to elaborate, or yeah, I mean, I would perhaps, if I try to translate or to convey. Okay, yes, I think it's the best because I will try to make an interpretation. Alex, can you unmute yourself, or do we have to do this? I'm not that Zoom experienced.
I can't find you. Whoever you are, you're not there.
Strange. Maybe I answer what I understand, or maybe I just explain what I meant by, I mean, this also is an idea in Mark Fisher's, last book, The Weird and the Eerie. There he's discussing the unheimlich and the unhomely, as in, he was saying that I'm like amused that I didn't think about the figure of the weird.
It's good. You can talk.
Oh, great. Okay, so you can just maybe
unmute. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Yes. I arrived unfortunately at the end of your presentation, so I was struck by what you were saying about it. So it was indeed asking you to clarify how you understood it, but beside the Mark Fisher reference, what I meant by neoliberalism as an aesthetic, to my experience, has a tendency to play on this kind of double identity of something that is very visible, accessible, relatable, whatever, and that can feel familiar, and this kind, mostly on the level of scale to which you were referring to, has this kind of mystery, abstract, and this kind of non, like, causal, but in still kind of a mysterious way. And so it just I was just like wanted to hear you more about it, because I think it's a very this project of weird economies is super exciting. At the same time, I wonder to which extent it's also a mode of weaponizing something that is pre-existing, or sidetracking. I'm not,
Yeah, actually that I think is a very good question, also to bring up the figure of scale at the end, because it's something that I hoped I could mention in the talk, but there was no more time to add it to this 30 minutes presentation. But essentially, I think what I'm trying to do after all I said is that I'm trying to take the market, the idea of the market, seriously. And this is what I feel like backtracking, these notions to these original thinkers of the neoliberal thought collective, Friedrich Hayek. It's something that's not usually taken, seriously enough in the left. And there are few people who are discussing how they thought about the market and the problem of knowledge, which, is also a problem of scale. Because they thought this is the only way that, to have knowledge accessible to such a large scale, like the only form that could make this happen would be the market. So in a way, they recognize something that seems quite accurate to me, the problem of knowledge, which takes a very wrong turn. And also the market is not, as we know, the only entity that can do this scalable project. So all that we are trying, like many people who, I'm reading are trying to do, is to think about, the design of non-markets. But like to do that, the market has to be taken seriously. And basically, so someone like Morozov, he says that he has a very basic understanding of neoliberalism, a definition of neoliberalism, and he basically puts it as neoliberalism is essentially the condition where, it's kind of like removes any idea of scale from any other form of political thinking. So the only thing that neoliberalism kind of like is a monopoly on scale. And every other form of practice, like, they can be functional in a, in a church or at home or, at a school. But as soon as they start to expand and they start to become scalable, and that's when they face, the barriers and the resistance from, neoliberal frames. So this is why I think it's really important to think about scale seriously. And for that, we have to understand how the market works, because it does have that monopoly on scale at the moment. So this would be, I hope, like this answers the...
Do you think of the market potentially as a medium?
I think it's like a platform and an infrastructure, basically. Like, how Amazon is. Amazon is a market because it's a combination of a platform and an infrastructure at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's Lord is there. No, that's a really amazing, important point, the question of scale. Perhaps we wrap up and close the evening. Is there something, Antoine, Vanessa and Basile, you would like to add or to share something that also came to your mind?
I don't want to add anything. You discussed a lot. Thank you, Bahar.
Thank you.
I don't need to add anything else either. I think the discussion was quite complete.
Me neither. Thank you, Bahar.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Bahar and Vanessa and Antoine and Basile and everyone who contributed and joined, and many open questions still to embark on further and to be continued. Thank you very much. Take care. And yeah, good evening. Thank you.
Good evening.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you.
Bye.